Robert had always taken decent care of himself. He didn't overeat, walked nearly every day, and tried to make smart choices when it came to food. But now, at 67, something had shifted. No matter how much he walked or how many salads he ate, the soft roundness of his belly seemed to grow. He found himself standing in front of the mirror, pulling at his shirt, wondering why this was happening. It wasn't just the appearance that bothered him. He felt slower, more tired, less like himself. His doctor had told him everything looked within normal range, but Robert knew his body was changing in ways no blood test could capture. He had even tried cutting back on portions, skipping dinner, and pushing himself to jog again. None of it worked. If anything, he felt worse. The truth, which no one had ever clearly explained to him, was that his body was responding to internal shifts beyond his control. Around age 60, something quiet but powerful begins to happen inside the body. It's not about willpower, laziness, or doing something wrong. It's about hormones, and the most notorious of them is cortisol, the stress hormone. Cortisol plays an essential role in helping the body respond to danger. But when its levels are consistently elevated, even without visible stress, it signals the body to hold on to fat, especially around the belly. And that's exactly what was happening to Robert. His body wasn't failing him. It was trying to protect him, misinterpreting poor sleep, blood sugar swings, and low-grade inflammation as signs of a threat. The belly fat was a built-in survival response. The deeper issue is that this fat, known as visceral fat, isn't just inconvenient, it's dangerous. It wraps around internal organs like the liver and intestines and increases the risk of heart disease, cognitive decline, and type 2 diabetes. Yet, the cruel irony is that the more Robert tried to fight it with strict dieting or long cardio sessions, the more his cortisol rose, worsening the cycle. What he needed wasn't more discipline. It was more understanding. His body was no longer running on youthful fuel. It needed a different kind of care. The key wasn't to fight harder, but to listen more closely to what his body was trying to say. And what it said, quite clearly, was, "Help me rebalance." Robert sat by the window that afternoon, sipping a cup of herbal tea his daughter had recommended. The quiet warmth of the kitchen contrasted with the questions stirring in his mind. He had recently stumbled upon an article, not some flashy headline, but a thoughtful explanation of something he had never truly considered before. Hormones, not just testosterone, which he'd heard about in commercials, but an intricate web of chemical messengers quietly shaping everything from his weight to his energy, and even how he felt about life. The more he read, the more it made sense. It wasn't just about aging, it was about balance, or the gradual loss of it. At the heart of his struggle was cortisol, the stress hormone. In youth, cortisol rose during emergencies and dropped just as quickly. But now, even without danger, Robert's body seemed stuck in a quiet state of alarm. Sleepless nights, skipped meals, emotional worries. All of it was now being interpreted as threats. And cortisol responded like a loyal soldier, storing fat to protect him. But cortisol wasn't acting alone. There was insulin, the active hormone responsible for managing blood sugar. In earlier years, a slice of bread or a bowl of cereal barely made a dent. But now, every sweet bite or high-carb snack could send his insulin soaring. The problem wasn't just the sugar. It was what happened afterward. A crash, a craving, and a cycle that left him exhausted and craving more. Then came the realization that both estrogen and testosterone played unexpected roles. As a man, Robert had never thought twice about estrogen. But with age, his levels had dropped. Not just testosterone, but estrogen too. And oddly enough, fat tissue began producing a small amount of estrogen in response, which encouraged the body to hold on to even more fat. It was a hormonal loop, self-perpetuating and relentless. He had always believed weight loss was about calories in versus calories out. But suddenly, that logic seemed overly simplistic. The truth was that his body was doing everything it could to maintain what it thought was safety. And when he restricted calories or forced himself to exercise harder, his body didn't interpret it as discipline. It saw it as stress. So, what was the alternative? Robert began to see a new path, not to wage war against his body, but to work with it. By supporting his hormones, gently, patiently, he could change the conversation happening within. And in that shift, perhaps, lie the beginnings of real transformation. Robert's wife, Helen, had always been a lively woman. She loved gardening, morning walks, and trying new recipes. But over the past few years, Robert had noticed subtle changes in her. She complained more often about fatigue, struggled with sleep, and grew frustrated by the extra weight around her waist that refused to budge. At first, she chalked it up to menopause and getting older. Something inevitable, perhaps even acceptable. But deep down, it didn't feel right. Their experiences were different, but the underlying thread was the same. Age had begun to quietly reshape their bodies from the inside out. Helen's drop in estrogen didn't just influence her mood or hot flashes, it directly impacted her metabolism. As estrogen declined, her body began storing more fat, particularly around her midsection. What she didn't realize was that this was her body's way of trying to restore balance, since fat cells can produce a small amount of estrogen. It was a survival mechanism, not a failure. For Robert, the fall in testosterone brought its own set of challenges. It wasn't just about physical strength or libido, though those had changed too, but also about energy, confidence, and motivation. He found it harder to focus, slower to recover after activity, and more vulnerable to weight gain, especially in places where he'd never carried fat before. And then there was the hormone neither of them had ever heard of until recently, adiponectin. This lesser-known but vital hormone, produced by fat cells, actually helps regulate metabolism and support insulin sensitivity. The catch? The more visceral fat you carry, the deep, dangerous kind, the less adiponectin your body produces. It was as if the very fat their bodies were storing was making it harder to lose fat at all. Together, they began to realize that these weren't isolated frustrations. They were connected, deeply and biologically. Their hormones were shifting, like the tides, gradually but persistently, altering the landscape of their bodies and minds. But perhaps the most important insight was this: the process wasn't irreversible. One evening, after a shared walk around the block, Helen looked at Robert and said softly, "I think our bodies are asking for help, not punishment." And in that moment, something shifted for them both. They no longer saw their symptoms as failures, but as signals. And those signals, if listened to with care, might lead them toward healing. They had already begun to understand the power of sleep in this puzzle. Now, they were ready to take the next step, starting from the kitchen table. The next morning, Robert and Helen stood side by side in the kitchen, staring thoughtfully into their pantry. Something had changed in the way they looked at food. No longer was it just about calories or fiber or what was labeled low fat. Now, it was about hormones, those invisible messengers they'd only recently begun to understand. What they discovered in their own cupboards was sobering. Their morning coffee ritual, once comforting, had become a red flag. Robert had read that caffeine on an empty stomach could spike cortisol levels dramatically, especially in older adults. "No wonder I feel jittery after just 1 cup," he said, reaching for the decaf. Helen nodded, recalling how restless she often felt even after short naps. They agreed to try a small breakfast before their morning brew, giving their bodies a gentler start. Then there were the so-called healthy cereals and granola bars. Helen picked up a box she used to eat every morning. "Whole grain," it said in bold letters, but the second ingredient was sugar. These refined carbs, they now knew, caused blood sugar to surge, leading to elevated insulin and increased fat storage, particularly around the belly. Even worse, the cycle of spikes and crashes left them tired and craving more. Robert pulled out a bottle of vegetable oil, the kind they'd used for years without a second thought. Soybean, corn, and canola oils were common in almost everything. But recent reading had shown how these oils, rich in omega-6 fats, promote chronic inflammation. And inflammation, as they'd learned, pushed cortisol higher and threw hormones further off track. "What about wine?" Helen asked. They both paused. Their evening glass of red had become a ritual. But alcohol, even in small amounts, temporarily increases estrogen and reduces testosterone. It also interferes with sleep, the very thing they needed most for recovery. "Maybe not every night," Robert offered gently. She agreed. Then there were the protein bars and yogurts labeled sugar-free. Helen checked the ingredients. Sucralose, aspartame, names she had once ignored. Now, she knew these artificial sweeteners disrupted gut bacteria, which in turn affected hormone production and stress levels. It became clear. Their pantry was filled with well-marketed items that silently worked against them, but instead of feeling discouraged, they felt empowered. They didn't need perfection, just awareness. With each small shift, they could begin to heal from the inside out. Helen smiled as she started clearing a shelf. "Let's make room for something better." Over the next few days, Robert and Helen transformed their kitchen into something of a small laboratory of healing. Gone were the brightly packaged, low-fat snacks and sugar-free treats. In their place appeared glass containers filled with colorful produce, leafy greens, nuts, seeds, and ingredients that felt more alive, more nourishing. Their grocery trips became more intentional. They skipped the center aisles and spent most of their time in the outer sections, the places where real food lived. Helen reached for a perfectly ripe avocado one afternoon, holding it in her hands like something precious. "Can you believe we used to avoid these because they're fatty?" she chuckled. Now she understood that the monounsaturated fats in avocados help stabilize insulin and reduce inflammation, all while supporting the production of hormones like testosterone. Robert, who never much cared for fish, gave wild-caught salmon another try. It wasn't his favorite, but the promise of omega-3s, known to reduce cortisol and improve cell signaling, was too compelling to ignore. He added sardines to his lunches, surprising himself at how satisfying they were with a little mustard and whole grain toast. For plant-based days, they incorporated flax seeds into their smoothies and salads, and Helen found comfort in cracking walnuts by hand. These small rituals became more than just food choices. They were acts of care. They were decisions rooted in understanding, not fear. Eggs, once pushed aside due to cholesterol warnings, returned proudly to their table, yolks and all. They learned that cholesterol is not the villain it was once believed to be, but rather a building block for sex hormones, including estrogen and testosterone. A warm egg breakfast replaced sugary cereals, keeping them full longer and providing stable energy for the day. In the afternoons, instead of cookies or crackers, they reached for berries, rich in fiber, low in sugar, and bursting with antioxidants. Blueberries, blackberries, raspberries. They rotated between them like old friends. These dark berries supported their gut health, improved insulin sensitivity, and calmed inflammation in the most delicious way. Spinach, kale, and Swiss chard found their way into soups, salads, and sautés. Their magnesium content not only relaxed Robert's muscles after walks, but helped both of them sleep more deeply at night. Each meal became an opportunity, not to count or restrict, but to restore. They weren't chasing perfection, just momentum. And slowly, their bodies responded, not with dramatic change, but with something quieter. Clarity, steadiness, hope. The shift wasn't only happening in Robert and Helen's kitchen, it began to extend into how they moved through their days. Literally. Gone was the idea that they needed to punish their bodies with long workouts or keep pace with the routines they had followed in their 40s. Now, their approach to movement was slower, gentler, and surprisingly more effective. It all started with a simple decision: to walk with intention. Not the rushed errands or the distracted strolls, but real walking, where breathing was deep, eyes took in the sky, and steps matched a calm, steady rhythm. They called it their reset walk. It wasn't about burning calories. It was about reconnecting with their bodies, bringing down stress, and letting their minds settle. But the most powerful new practice came not through movement, but stillness. Robert had read about diaphragmatic breathing, the kind where the belly expands on the inhale and contracts on the exhale, gently coaxing the body into parasympathetic rest and repair mode. One quiet evening, he tried it for the first time. Sitting on the couch, one hand on his chest, the other on his stomach, he inhaled through his nose for 4 seconds, held it for 4, and exhaled through his mouth for 6. To his surprise, he felt calmer almost instantly, not sleepy, just peaceful. Helen joined him the next night. What began as 5-minute experiments turned into a nightly ritual. 15 minutes before bed, sometimes with soft music, sometimes in silence. Within a week, their sleep deepened. Robert no longer woke up at 3 a.m., mind racing. Helen's dreams returned, vivid and gentle. They added small, strength-focused movements twice a week. Nothing strenuous. Just body-weight squats by the kitchen counter, wall push-ups, and a few stretches with resistance bands. It wasn't about building muscle to show off. It was about telling their bodies, "You're still capable. You're still strong." Robert noticed he had more energy during the day. Helen, always skeptical of exercise routines, admitted she looked forward to their short sessions. There was no guilt if they skipped a day, no pressure to sweat or push through pain. The goal had shifted. It was no longer about effort, but about rhythm. They weren't fighting age. They were befriending it, creating space, breath by breath, for healing to take root. And through that stillness and slow movement, their bodies began to whisper back, "Thank you." The shift wasn't only happening in Robert and Helen's kitchen, it began to extend into how they moved through their days. Literally. Gone was the idea that they needed to punish their bodies with long workouts or keep pace with the routines they had followed in their 40s. Now, their approach to movement was slower, gentler, and surprisingly more effective. It all started with a simple decision: to walk with intention. Not the rushed errands or the distracted strolls, but real walking, where breathing was deep, eyes took in the sky, and steps matched a calm, steady rhythm. They called it their reset walk. It wasn't about burning calories. It was about reconnecting with their bodies, bringing down stress, and letting their minds settle. But the most powerful new practice came not through movement, but stillness. Robert had read about diaphragmatic breathing, the kind where the belly expands on the inhale and contracts on the exhale, gently coaxing the body into parasympathetic rest and repair mode. One quiet evening, he tried it for the first time. Sitting on the couch, one hand on his chest, the other on his stomach, he inhaled through his nose for 4 seconds, held it for 4, and exhaled through his mouth for 6. To his surprise, he felt calmer almost instantly, not sleepy, just peaceful. Helen joined him the next night. What began as 5-minute experiments turned into a nightly ritual. 15 minutes before bed, sometimes with soft music, sometimes in silence. Within a week, their sleep deepened. Robert no longer woke up at 3 a.m., mind racing. Helen's dreams returned, vivid and gentle. They added small, strength-focused movements twice a week. Nothing strenuous. Just body-weight squats by the kitchen counter, wall push-ups, and a few stretches with resistance bands. It wasn't about building muscle to show off. It was about telling their bodies, "You're still capable. You're still strong." Robert noticed he had more energy during the day. Helen, always skeptical of exercise routines, admitted she looked forward to their short sessions. There was no guilt if they skipped a day, no pressure to sweat or push through pain. The goal had shifted. It was no longer about effort, but about rhythm. They weren't fighting age. They were befriending it, creating space, breath by breath, for healing to take root. And through that stillness and slow movement, their bodies began to whisper back, "Thank you.